Julia and the Mountains. Julia sat in the comfortable wagon chair, leaning back, and looked out at the mesmerizing landscape outside the window. The train was speeding along the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was noticeable by the way the sparse, stumpy trees with their crowns battered by the winds in the same direction appeared and disappeared rapidly out the window. The train seemed to rush on a purple velvet carpet, but, in fact, flowers were blooming on the slopes of the mountains. Julia had seen nothing like it. Purple flowers covered the entire space on the sunny hillsides. The mountains, already clearly visible behind these hills, were not yet rocky. Instead, it was a foothill with plenty of fertile lands on the gentle slopes and room to see. The snowy peaks of real mountains rose above it all, far beyond the hills. It seemed as if someone had poured white sugar sand into the sky, mixed with a scattering of diamonds, so sparkling was their eternal snow. The blue sky shaded the whiteness of the snowy peaks. It seemed as if the white caps of the Rocky Mountains would fly away and disappear into the sky with the slightest breeze rather than be attached to the ground. Outside the window of the passenger car, the blindingly white peaks of the Rocky Mountains did not change their position. The train would never arrive at its destination, which should be somewhere far away, at the foot of those cliffs. The young woman, Julia, was very attractive looking, with medium length, dark hair that fell beautifully to her shoulders, shading her alabaster skin. Her dark eyebrows drew high half-circles over her hazel, almost green eyes. A thin nose with a slight hook and beautifully defined nostrils would have given her face a predatory expression were it not for her full, sensual lips, which were set in a thoughtful smile. Her figure was quite formed, full breasts, a thin waist, and steep hips. However, his simple straight jeans and the plaid man's long-sleeved shirt she wore did not diminish her feminine appeal in the slightest. This splendor of a woman's body mesmerized the men who rode with her in the same wagon. So, naturally, they indifferently tried to pretend that they were looking at something outside the window or on their cell phones. Still, in fact, they constantly threw appreciative glances at this beauty. Well, Julia did not notice them. Her thoughts were far away. She remembered what had happened yesterday between her and her lover. They had broken up forever. Julia was not ready for the attention of men. She thought all of them, men like her ex, wanted only momentary pleasures and that the responsibility for a family and future child was the 10th thing. Julia rested her hand on her cheek and looked sadly out the window in her thoughts. A man in his mid-30s and a young boy, perhaps 6 years old, entered the carriage through the aisle door opposite Julia. They took seats next to Julia's, a couple of rows ahead of her. As soon as they sat down, they started playing a board game, tossing chips and moving them around on a piece of cardboard. Julia noticed them precisely because this attractive man didn't notice her. Instead, he was fascinated by his little ward, who looked just like him. That the boy was playing a board game somehow interested Julia, too, and she looked sideways at her neighbors. Even though she could see perfectly well how the other men in the carriage looked at her, this man was still not paying attention to her. He did not think to turn around, like the other men, to assess the situation and, perhaps, present himself in the best possible way. Instead, all his attention was given to the boy. "I guess it is a son," Julia sighed. She wanted children badly, but her personal life wasn't working out. Julia didn't want to live with a man just because she liked him. She wanted to find a life mate who loved her and wanted to have children with her. But so far, she had not met that kind of man. Her ex-boyfriend loved only the enjoyment he got from possessing such an attractive woman. And what Julia wanted from their life together, he would not give her. Her ex-boyfriend did not want children. He did not want them, not just with her. "It is too early for me," he said in response to Julia's cautious questions about whether it was time for them to have a baby. Julia looked at the couple, the man and apparently his son, and thought about her life. Suddenly the train car jerked to a halt in front of the train station, and the chip that the boy had been moving on the map of his board game flew off their table and rolled right under Julia's feet. Julia reached under her chair and fumbled around until she found the plastic chip from their board game. She clutched the chip in her palm, about to stand up to give it back, when the man, comforting the boy, exclaimed, "It is okay, it is okay. We will get your chip now." And, kneeling down, he crawled on all fours down the aisle under the nearby car seats to find the chip. So the man crawled down the aisle a couple of meters toward Julia, apologizing to the passengers he had disturbed and fumbling with his hands under their seats. Julia sat motionless and watched him. She should have told him she had found and picked up that chip, but something prevented her from doing so. So, she wanted him to approach her just like that, on all fours. You could not think of a funnier way to meet him. Finally, the man stumbled to Julia's feet and raised his head, clearly about to apologize again. Instead, he saw Julia, who had evidently been watching his journey across the floor with interest, with a slight smile playing on her lips. The woman was twisting their chip in her thin fingers. He noticed that the young woman's hands were beautifully shaped, with small hands and neat, thin, but strong fingers. In addition, there was no nail polish or rings on the young woman's fingers, which gave her hands a pristine cleanliness. Looking up at the young woman, the man's gaze moved upward, slid down Julia's slender legs and thin waist, and finally met hers. Julia got an electric shock. The most attractive man in the world was kneeling in front of her and looking at her. He was simply the embodiment of her erotic romantic dreams that came to her in the morning. Unfortunately, Julia immediately forgot what she had done with this handsome man when she woke up. Still, after these dreams, her whole body was filled with longing and a desire to do it again. The man froze, too. He was still kneeling in front of Julia, and the passengers paid attention to them again. Finally, the man was the first to break the silence. Excuse me, I lost one thing here." He rose easily from his knees, and before Julia was a tall and stout young man, whose impetuous rush to stand in front of her confused her, for he smelled of good shaving lotion. Yes, he was clean-shaven. And something tart, like the smell of dressed leather for saddles or flip bags for horses. There was also a cloud of scent and warmth from his body, making Julia's head spin. "Well, it is all going to end now, just like a dream," thought Julia, not saying a word. Instead, she stared into the man's eyes, never taking her eyes off him. Her pupils dilated and her cheeks flushed. Julia's whole gut seemed to burn with something unknown to her but was terribly attractive. The man stood in front of her and looked her in the eye. He was clearly embarrassed. Apparently, he did not intend to have a long conversation with the stranger, but just wanted his son's toy. Julia finally came to her senses, lowered her head, and simply held out to the man the thing he was looking for. When the man's warm and large palm covered Julia's palm, her heart pounded as if she were running. Yes, she should have been running headlong away from here, but she could not. This man drew her in like he was made for her. How do I know he even likes me? As she watched the man thank her and tuck a chip into his pocket before returning to the spot where the boy was waiting for him, Julia tried to calm herself. But Julia was not looking at his pockets. Instead, she was looking at what was in the middle of them, his firm ass, which was tightly wrapped in dark blue denim. Oh my God, is it okay to look at a man's butt? What the hell are you thinking, you fool? He is married and has a child, so Julia tried to cool herself off, but she was not very good at it. The woman looked away, but the man spun around and saw that she was looking at him. He seemed to understand everything, and he looked very pleased. After all, he had impressed this young woman, and what man would refuse such an adventure? But suddenly, the boy got up from his seat and walked toward his father. Then, wrapping his arms around his father's leg with his little hands, the boy lifted his head, looked at his father, and asked, "Well, did you find my toy?" The man, looking down at his son, put his palm on his son's shoulder and answered, "Yes, honey, I found everything. Here you go." With these words, he took out of his jeans pocket and handed the boy his chip. Julia, who had no children, watched the scene with interest and some envy for the woman who got such a handsome man. Now, there are men in the world who want to have children and take care of them like this handsome man. I never thought a man of such attractiveness could be a caring father. Or maybe my prejudices dictate this. This is the image of a caring father and a boring, unattractive man. And this man is. He looks like a sex symbol, and there is no way he could be a good father, the young woman thought. Meanwhile, the man briefly thanked Julia for her help and, turning his back to her, led his son to his seat and sat beside him. Then the man no longer turned to Julia. Instead, he talked to his son and showed him something through the train window. Julia could see the man's chopped profile, his proud eagle nose, sensuous lips, and steep chin. The man's eyes, however, dipped in wrinkles resembling laughter when he was speaking to his son. Obviously, this amused the child and was more pleasant to him than just showing everyone his masculinity. That he cared for his tiny son gave him much more masculinity in Julia's eyes than how wide he spread his legs, resting on the floor, or how wide his shoulders were. Julia realized the game had completely absorbed the couple. Finally, the young woman awoke from her thoughts and decided that she had had enough of these thoughts that were throwing her off balance. I need to get on with my life, not looking at strangers with children, she thought, turning away from the man and his son, and trying to find something special in the scenery flying by outside the window. Out there, outside the window, everything was special. But this man in front of her, a few meters away, piqued her interest. And there was nothing more Julia could do to keep this handsome man in her life. But, unfortunately, he was married, and she should stop thinking about him. Breaking up families is not my relationship-building style, she thought, gazing hard into the hills outside the car window. I do not have a relationship. There is not and will not be if I do not do something now. Julia suddenly thought. But she did not decide to do anything. Her mind could not think of anything that would be an excuse to go up and talk to the man and interrupt their game. So, glancing sideways at the father and son couple in front, Julia sat for about half an hour for the rest of the trip. When the name of her station appeared on the train's dashboard, Julia stood up, took one last look at the man and his son, who were still busy playing their game, and sighed as she left the train. She turned around a few more times, hoping that this handsome man was darting her on the station platform, trying to ask her what her name was. But no one followed her. Instead, the other passengers who got off with her at the station quietly went their separate ways. Family or friends greeted some, and some hurried to the cab stand. Julia decided not to turn around again. Instead, she adjusted the travel bag strap on her shoulder, shook her hair, and, pacing widely, headed toward the train station building. She should also have taken a cab since she did not know where her hotel was located or where she had spent this Valentine's Day holiday. Now it was not her holiday, and with the success she had today, she would never have a reason to get Valentine's card again. There was simply no one to send her such a card. After taking a cab with almost no line, Julia drove for another hour through the winding hills of the foothills. Finally, she arrived at a small hotel on the side of the mountain. Yes, this is a place to rest and forget everything that has happened in my life lately, thought the young woman as she placed her belongings in the antique closet. The wooden floors of her hotel room creaked pleasantly as she trod the floor. The hotel designer decorated the bed in rustic style. An iron base piled many things, from a couple of thin mattresses, pillows, and blankets to a fluffy bathrobe, neatly folded and covered with the same fluffy terry slippers. Julia studied the dinner menu and took a hotel information folder from her bedside table. She opened it and froze. The same man she had just met on the train was looking at her. And next to him was his wife, probably at least a woman his age. Julia dropped the folder on the bed, sat down on the mattress, and then collapsed on it with her back and hands behind her head. What a life! He is here, and his wife is here. What a torment! I have got to get out of here and go someplace else. I cannot be here and watch another woman own and control this handsome man. So Julia thought, and tears streamed from her eyes. Half an hour later, Julia gathered her things, put them in her traveling bag, and went out into the hallway to tell the porter that she was leaving and only wanted to pay for that night, not all 7, as had been booked in her name. At the front desk, Julia's gaze fell upon a photograph of the handsome man she had met on the train. Here he was alone, or not, he had a child in his arms. But where was the mother, the wife? Julia's thoughts flew in different directions, like frightened birds. Seeing the expression of anguish on the guest's face, the porter followed her gaze and said courteously, "Ah, this is a picture of our host, Mr. Jones, and his son. It is a pity about the boy, for he was left without a mother at such an early age. But his father, Mr. Jones, is so caring, he—" Julia was no longer listening to what the proscenium was saying. Instead, she stood staring at the picture, dumbfounded, realizing that nothing was lost, that everything was just beginning. The young woman finally woke up from her pleasant shock. She mechanically took her passport from the counter and, walking back to her room, nodded thankfully to the porter, smiling at him goodbye. The porter was pleased not only to have improved the guest's mood but would probably get a good reward from his host because now this young woman had changed her mind about suddenly leaving their hotel and was staying all week, as planned. As he arranged the guest cards on his desk shelf, the porter thought that he would be a good worker if he could persuade this young woman to continue her stay at their hotel. Oh, they do not have many guests this season, everyone is worth his weight in gold. His host, Mr. Jones, will also be very pleased to have such a beautiful and very pleasant young woman staying at their inn. So perhaps the evening will go well for them all, the porter will go home, his host will come here for the evening, and he will cook dinner for the innkeepers. And this young woman will probably be as pleased as ever with the tasty dinner his host will provide. With these thoughts, the porter remained behind the counter as Julia returned to her hotel room. The young woman quickly scattered her things back on the shelves and, smiling out the window at the reflection of the setting sun, which colored the mountainsides on one side of the mountain range crimson, thought that there are still men who love their children and take care of them. And one of them is just around the corner. She had some reason to stay here all week and perhaps get to know the owner of this inn better. The sun had already given up hope of its rays once more caressing the mountains and had slipped behind the mountain slopes. Immediately, it became dark. The evening dusk set in, and night birds squeaked in the park bushes surrounding the hotel. Julia was still standing at the window, watching the last ray of sunlight. The light evening breeze fluttered her hair, and the young woman's heart felt warm, as if the sun remained here, with her, in her soul.